Dead Ringers is an intelligent drama that explores the psychosexual relationship of the Mantle brothers. They are twin gynecologists that, when put together, form one whole individual. This is David Cronenberg at his most stylistically reticent and careful. It is an excellent example of detached filmmaking aesthetics. Dead Ringers sees Cronenberg mature into a wonderfully astute and visually industrious filmmaker. Dead Ringers is a film about separation. It's about the catastrophe of individuality. It's about illusory distinctions. Pain distorts character. To the Mantle twins, there is no difference between sex and science. The two are one in the same. The Mantle twins view themselves in the exact same way. They think of themselves in interchangeable dimensions. Their synchronized destruction stems from a dual psychological conflict. It's about becoming a victim to ease the pain of being a survivor. It's about more than incestual attraction. It's about spiritual transfiguration. It's about an obsession with the peculiar idea of bodily perfection. It's about finding no faults in the instrument, but infinite flaws with the body. The instrument is the spirit or the mind. The illusory concept here is that this perfect spirit has been split between two imperfect bodies, therefore corrupting the immaculate instrument itself. The twins are perceived as one person, and that's because, for all intents and purposes, they very much are. By their own admission, Beverly and Elliot Mantle are one and the same. A correlation arises between the concepts of psychological separation and objective sexual identities. They both prove to be grim impossibilities on the basis of a derisive impulse. The Mantle brothers don't yearn for separation at all. They dream of sex, of becoming one, and of an unattainable intimacy with each other. They love each other in every virtuous possible way, as colleagues, as brothers, and as passionate lovers, as something infinitely beyond themselves. David Cronenberg's Dead Ringers is a psychosexual love story. It is about the hearts of the Mantle brothers. It's about what they desire most, and that is each other's touch, one another's kiss, and their unbearable longing for spiritual unification. It's about romance. It's about forbidden tenderness. Dead Ringers is, I think, ultimately about love. What would you say it's Dead Ringers is about?
Well, it's definitely got those themes you mentioned. Also, the fact that it's Freudian, it's got a skewed interpretation of love,
Oh, yeah,
sex.
absolutely.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't bring up Freud enough when talking about Cronenberg, and I think
Mm-hmm.
there's no better way to analyze his films. I think he's a deeply Freudian director. I think
Mm-hmm.
in films like Dead Ringers, like Videodrome, like The Fly, I think that he follows Freudian language completely, like all throughout his filmography, specifically his interpretation of dreams. I
Mm-hmm.
would say the more outlandish concepts of Freud seem to be fully embraced by David Cronenberg.
It's interesting you mentioned that because right there in the middle of the film, when Beverly is with Claire and that hiatus from Ellie, he has that crazy dream, and that was like so David Cronenberg esque.
Oh yeah, when they're
Yeah.
like actually the attachment is hyper literalized and then
Mm-hmm.
made morbid, made completely morbid and disturbing, since he is a master of body horror, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the most horrific part of this film is how there's the marriage between the ideal or the pursuit of perfection and the actual life experience of being an imperfect person. Because, like I said, you can put together Beverly and Elliot and get one healthy individual. And I think they're extremely cognizant of that as well. Um, they even have little monologues, little tidbits about how there should be beauty contests set to the standards of what's inside the body, things like that. These are people who are like hyper obsessed with a very morbid form of perfection. And yeah, this was my first Cronenberg film. I think I watched it when I was at like 13 on IFC or something. I was kind of astounded by the film when I first watched it. Never saw anything quite like it. Of course, it being my first Cronenberg film, I also wasn't too familiar with the Freudian symbolism that was being used ad nauseum. I wasn't
Yeah.
used to a lot of things, but it definitely turned me into an admirer of Cronenberg and a diehard fan of Jeremy Irons, who this is one of the best performances of the 80s, probably only beaten out by De Niro in 1980's Raging Bull. This is an incredible performance. And yeah, I do have to mash the two twins together to get that full performance from him, because one twin's lacking while the other one is overcompensating for certain areas of emotionality.
Yeah, now that you mention it, I do want to take the moment to just like first praise David Cronenberg for his still shots when he's in those moments, and showing Jeremy Irons playing out each role. How is he able to do that? Like, just getting, he had stunt doubles, or
Well, yeah, a lot of what we're seeing are stand-ins, people, with their hair cut to look exactly like it with similar body types. But then when they're seeing them both in the same exact frame,
yeah,
that's kind of an older experimental technique. But I think that David Cronenberg perfected it here,
yeah.
and I think he did it wonderfully well.
Yeah, I just wanted to take a moment to just really compliment that. That was really good because it had me fooled. I thought for a second that there was two actors and they were actually like David Cronenberg selected twins.
Oh yeah.
And he's like, oh yeah, these twins are going to be great for this role here.
Well, I feel like credit belongs to both the actor and director for that. Then
Yeah.
that's the ultimate magic trick of the film,
Mhm.
is
Had me
making you.
fooled.
And to Jeremy Irons' credit, both of these characters are their complications and they're idiosyncratic and they're very unique.
Mhm.
And you can tell who's who when it matters, when you're supposed to know who's who.
Yeah.
When those lines are supposed to be completely blurred and almost impossible to decipher, you don't know who's who. And it gets more difficult at certain times. I think it's a really interesting movie. But I liked, we were talking a little bit before we recorded this, and I liked your criticisms of it as well. But the criticisms lie with Freud, and that I really got to emphasize that Cronenberg is an extraordinarily Freudian director. He's a complete pupil of Freud, and he obviously understands Freud incredibly well.
Mhm.
And it makes for wonderful body horror, because a lot of what Freud, a lot of his theories and concepts are kind of terrifying.
Oh yeah.
Especially when you hyper literalize them, like Cronenberg likes to do in Scanners, in Videodrome, in Eastern Promises. Every one of his films is deeply Freudian. But what were some of your criticisms of the film?
For starters, you do, Freud's dream interpretations. The Interpretations of Dreams is the book. So that's the reference manual for that. It has had a lot of criticism over the years. I do have to credit Freud. I mean, I'm not a psychologist or anything. I'm not an expert. I do have a penchant for psychology to enjoy studying it as a whole. And he did take an evolutionary perspective to the whole of it, which I enjoyed. At the same time, took way too much what I would call liberty with his own interpretations. And this is also at the time of psychology when there wasn't awareness of things like cognitive biases. So all of that is something to take into consideration when deconstructing something like a David Cronenberg film, because the modern advances in psychology now point out how it is that Freud is flawed and in what ways. So that's where I would get the criticism, and I would levy it against this particular film here in Dead Ringers, because you have this kind of back and forth, especially with the visceral imagery of that particular dream and how they're connected as Siamese twins. And that's just one thing where Freud is saying, in the interpretations of dreams, that there's this pathway to the unconscious through dreams that we can get at. and we can really dig in deep and figure out what really makes us tick, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And as it turns out, a lot of that's kind of like hoopla. You know what I mean? Like, we don't really know, like, at the end of the day, what really consciousness is, whether it's its own thing or whether it's a part of something. Obviously, there's been a lot of advancements in that, so I'm not going to sit there and say that there isn't something to know. There's a lot to know. There's a lot to study. At the same time, it's still the hard problem of consciousness, right? That's still a philosophical problem, right? Not to dig in too deep and to get too sidetracked, right? But going back to Dead Ringers, we can see that David Cronenberg adopts the same flaws as the Freudian interpretation of things.
Well, possibly, but a horror movie should be flawed in order to scare you. Like the only way to counter those criticisms, which I think are perfectly fine, the only way to counter them is to assume that David Cronenberg doesn't want to particularly help his audience. And I'm not convinced he does. I'm not convinced he does want to teach us stuff. I think he more so wants to get a visceral reaction from his audience. Mm-hmm. He wants to get repulsion from his audience.
Okay.
And I think that, I don't necessarily believe that he's trying to teach any sort of valuable lesson. I think he is a horror filmmaker first and foremost, and I think that horror at its heart should be in debt to a deeply, deeply flawed philosophy, but that's what's horrifying about it, Then I think Dead Ringers falls into that category of if you look at it as a philosophy, or if you look at it as something with a moralizing statement, you can only walk away with a flawed response to it. Now, if Cronenberg's goal was to simply provide you with another body horror film that made you feel queasy and made you feel kind of weak or sick to your stomach, then it was successful.
Yeah.
And the Freudian symbolism, the language of Freudian symbolism, I think, is an unusually good tool to get that effect from an audience, because it does have we can even call it pseudo-intellectual if you want, because it does have that veneer of authority.
Right. So this is a good analogy to paint what you're saying clearly. So go back, way back, you go to Aristotle, and he tries to study the biology of creatures and his metaphysics and his logic of things. It's a lot like Freud was making the same mistake as Aristotle, where Aristotle just tried to shove his logic into everything and say this was the way it is. Freud was kind of doing the same thing with his psychoanalytic theory and trying to insert that into the whole of the mind, to the human mind. And in that way, that's the same mistake being made. It's just in a different lens. So David Cronenberg, again, adopts that same flaw, but as you pointed out, it's a body horror, and it did make me queasy.
Yeah.
So he perfected that. So, that's why I think it's a great film.
And I think that Cronenberg completely shows his hand, because there's a part where Beverly does have a violent reaction to being psychoanalyzed by Claire.
Yeah.
And he says, "What are you trying to fucking do? Psychoanalyze me? I'm not doing this. I'm not doing this right now." He shows his hand completely. He's telling you how to completely understand the scarier parts of the film. And if Freud were correct about his more outlandish concepts, we'd have a very terrifying existence. I mean, I think he's absolutely accurate in that depiction of Freud's reality that Freud knew and that Freud propagated, at least. And it does. When you use the tools of Freud, you are able to analyze things a lot more clearly. Like in that situation, he didn't want to be psychoanalyzed because she was asking him why he had a woman's name, Beverly, and yet his brother had a male name, like a traditional male name, like Elliot. Did his mother actually want a daughter? Like things like that. And with a Freudian guidebook, the analysis of that situation or that scenario, or why he had such a violent reaction to it, should be so obvious that I won't even dwell on it here. And if we're using the interpretation of dreams, even, I always loved One of the concepts Freud had that I loved, and I have seen it in at least 4 other Cronenberg films, like Videodrome, The Brood, and Scanners, including Dead Ringers, is hysterical identification. His belief that no one actually dreams as themselves, or that most of the time we're not dreaming as ourselves, that we're dreaming as someone that we know of, or an ideation of someone that we think we might want to be, but we're not dreaming of who we actually are. And that's why things are so alien, and that if we look into a mirror or something, we'd see a completely different person, that we're hysterically identifying with strangers or people that we don't know. And you can see that concept almost writ large, but made hyper intimate and nearly incestuous in this film as well. Freud is the guidebook to this movie, really. Even the phallic instruments, the most terrifying instruments in the film, that were made by Stephen Lack, the star of Scanners. Nice seeing his cameo, a nice Canadian actor who made the instruments in the film. Those instruments, those terribly medieval-looking or maybe even alien-looking phallic instruments that he wants to place up inside of women, are fascinating. This time I noticed his relationship with other men, which are non-existent. Beverly and Elliot don't have interactions with other men. I think they have them maybe 2 or 3 times, and they're not only they're either forgettable or they're extremely poorly mannered, right? He thinks that she's having an affair, and he says some crazy shit to her secretary on the phone, who's a male, and that's Beverly interacting with a male. And then when Elliot interacts with a male, it's someone who works at the hospital, and he gets his name wrong, because that's how much of an impression that men leave on these twins' minds. They don't even interact with other males. They are enough of that masculinity for either one of them. That's something I noticed this time, at least. But no, Freud is a deeply flawed thinker. But I think that a great horror movie has to have almost a deeply flawed idea of itself and of the world, or else it's not exactly terrifying. But if there was some sort of moralizing message we could take from the movie, what do you think? What do you think it was? I mean, I view it as a love story that's also a horror movie.
Well, with anything horror, you have to take that into consideration, especially when it comes to anything moral. So that you would have to understand that it's trying to make an absurdity of something, right?
Yes.
And you were trying, maybe even a bastardization of something,
yes,
in order for you to feel estranged from it, so you can see the fucked up level of it for what it is, right? And so in this particular case, perhaps the moral statement, one of them could be how screwed up incest is.
Yeah,
I mean, that's one example, right? One example. But another example would be, I mean, if we were to take something else, morally speaking, it's how callous some doctors can be.
True.
Yeah.
Well, I guess what more interests me is I think that if the film's trying to make any statement about anything, is about separation. It might not be like hyper literal, like separate yourself from your twin, but maybe from a larger aspect of your personality that you might find toxic or unnecessary now, or you feel is holding you back. But since it's a horror movie, do you feel that this film, it might be a moralizing statement, do you feel that it is for or against separation? Because it's also a tragedy.
Yeah, it is a tragedy, isn't it?
So, does Dead Ringers
feel... It would be for separation, right? Because that would be a sign of maturity, where you can be alone and you can... I don't know.
But what brings the horror into it is that Beverly is defected. He's the flawed twin or something. And no, I mean, Elliot would have been the same exact way. Elliot was the same exact way.
Right, which is why they synced.
Yeah, which I hope was a little dig at Young. I would appreciate that. When he says we just need to synchronize, that would have been nice. But I don't know if it's for or against separation.
Hard to say. I would say for separation, and that's because it leaves off on him crying over his brother's dead body, and Beverly's just there lamenting.
Well, like any good horror movie, we start with characters who are successful, extremely well off. I mean, They have their character flaws, but they're professionals.
Right.
And we end the movie with one cradling the other after he,
He does
carved into his stomach.
He does leave it ambiguous whether Beverly lives or not.
He does.
So there's that.
Well, there's also no possible way Beverly could have gone on long after that.
I mean, they did make that over. Well, David Cronenberg made
and
it. But, there's writers behind this.
The twins, Cronenberg co-wrote this as well. So he had a huge hand in this film. But the twins made a mistake when they were talking about what Ying and Chang, right? The famous Siamese twins. Mm-hmm. One died, the sickly one died first, the other died of fright. They made the, I think, fatal mistake of both assuming that Beverly was the sickly one, and that Elliot was the one who would die of fright. So Elliot's the more codependent one, whereas Beverly's the more self-destructive one. But I think that was an error that they made as well. I think Beverly was the more codependent one, whereas Elliot was the more self-destructive one, and the other one kept him in check. I mean, any way you split it, it's a tragedy, no matter how you look at it. Funny things I do know about this film is that it was originally called Twins, and I believe the Arnold Schwarzenegger and Danny DeVito comedy came out before it, called Twins. So they couldn't call it Twins. They had to call it Dead Ringers, which I think is a more fitting title. If they just called it Twins, I would have assumed they'd probably insult a lot of twins out there.
Yeah, so I want to pick your brain on something. What was because I'm a pleb when it comes to certain things. What was the inspiration behind Dead Ringers? Like, why did David Cronenberg call it that specifically?
I mean, he specifically called it that because the name Twins was taken. But
well, I mean, the alternative inspiration, I guess.
Something that inspired the story, I think, was something near to real life. It might even have been the Siamese twins that we mentioned. I don't know a lot about the history of this specific film.
Okay.
But, I mean, as we can tell, what primarily propels this movie forward in any sort of meaningful way is his understanding of Freud, which goes back to even the short films he made. Like, it's always been there. He's always been an advocate, a pupil of Freud. And I would say that this is a pretty good kind of... it's a cerebral film, but it's a pretty good kind of experimentation where he gets to experiment with Freudian dialogue and see if it can apply to what I think his version of a love story is. And it applies, in his world and his twisted ideal of a love story.
I love David Cronenberg. It's so good.
Oh, no, he's fantastic.
There has some particular scenes that I did not expect to laugh at all in this film.
Oh, yeah, I had a big laugh right before the big tragic ending where they're celebrating, like, a mock birthday or something, and Elliot's like, I want ice cream. And it was fucking hilarious. But Cronenberg, like, himself, I think, if you compare this movie to Videodrome or Scanners, I think that his composition, careful isn't the word, deliberate might be more accurate, but it's a pretty mature film. There's no wild composition. There's nothing wild going on with the camera. The camera is stationary a lot of the times, and when it does move, it does feel very kinetic. Like, I feel like he's mature in the sense that he knows he doesn't have to impress anyone, really.
True.
And I'm not saying the film isn't impressive. I love the color palette. I love that they look like archbishops when they're operating on women. That bright red in that very cool room.
Good observation.
There's still a lot of style to this film, but at the same time, I think it is... I again don't want to say careful because that implies that he thought he would make an error. Very confident. How about that? Like an extremely confident film that feels very deliberate and it's patient. It's patiently composed. Not to say it's a slow burner. It's just it has faith in its story. It has faith in its symbolism. And Cronenberg doesn't have to do anything crazy with the camera. And he only has those crazy body horror effects like maybe 2 or 3 times during the entire film.
Yeah.
And those moments are a lot more meaningful. It's not like in Videodrome, which I do love, but Videodrome is just that for an hour and a half. It's just the craziest, most grotesque, visceral imagery you could imagine for an hour and a half. Whereas Dead Ringers is maybe sober. Sober is a good way to put it too. It's a sober Cronenberg. It's a sober horror film.
Yeah, I can see that too. To me, it was because I've seen Videodrome. To me, it was this one, Dead Ringers. I mean, was a lot more. It was like I would even say tasteful with the way the body horror was presented.
No, that's good. That's also what I'm getting at. Yes.
Yeah.
Tasteful is a wonderful way to put it. And I think it is really a well put together film. I do think it is daring, and there are elements of the erotic thriller as well. But I like it because it's almost deconstructionist in that way. If you look back to the late '80s and early '90s, that's when the erotic thriller was incredibly popular, and we had Basic Instinct and Disclosure, and Michael Douglas. Basically, Michael Douglas being killed by beautiful women. It was like that subgenre or body of evidence. The erotic thriller was huge, the adult film or whatever. And this almost has a little. It has some qualities in common with that, but at the same time, it deconstructs them because the eroticism doesn't really lie with Claire Nouveau. It lies in this incestuous nature that exists granted, it's just a given that's always been there between the Mantle brothers and their love story and how it progresses and how it's
takes on a really screwed up Freudian turn.
Of course. And you can, of course, view it as well as, if you want to go, highly symbolic with it, yeah, these two twins represent one single person, but he's too detached from himself or something like that. But I think that takes obviously away from the horror of the film. I think that the incestuous nature has to be there in order for it to be truly terrifying. And Jeremy Irons just once again completely killed it. I do love the scene where he is Elliot and he orders the two escort twins. He orders the prostitutes up to his apartment, and he's like, just so I can tell you apart, you will call me Ellie, and you will call me Bev. And I thought that was an insanely impressive moment that he not only wants to, I think, carnally, viscerally experience his brother intimately, he wants to be him as well, if not temporarily, and also maybe even permanently. They are psychosexually obsessed with each other, and I think that's Freudian and manifest. It doesn't get much more Freudian than what I just said in that concept.
Yeah, there's that, and that actually had me laughing.
No, it was a good scene. It was good. Well, it's interesting because Elliot has the male name as well, but he also he most commonly goes by Ellie. A more feminine take on the name Elliot. Sure. So that also throws a kind of feminine tonality to the Mantle brothers' sexuality.
Speaking of which, now that I remembered something that I thought about during the scene when the body horror was first shown, and Claire was in that dream as well, and she bit the little piece between them. I saw that symbolism, and I wanted to comment on that. And I noticed that at the very end of the film as well, towards that same symbolism was carried over when he tried, not before he tried to call her on the telephone booth, but even prior to that when she was, part of that was in the middle of the psychoanalysis, which started to create the rift and their brotherhood. But then you had later on, towards the end, when Bev went back to her and she had a phone conversation with Ellie, and she basically was lambasting him, and it was you could tell that it really hurt Elliot. I was at that point thinking that Elliot was actually just going to murder her or something.
Well, I like that scene that you brought up where they are there's a literal appendage. They're attached to each other, and that dream sequence, because that the interpretation of that could be easily twofold. The obvious one is that she's going to separate the two twins, but the other one that I think probably goes unsaid a lot is Claire Nouveau's desperate want to have a child. And she is actually giving, she is taking two and making one at the same time. So she's almost having her own deranged child as well. She is taking these two twins and mashing them into one person. Maybe, obviously not by choice, but that's in effect what the result of having Claire Nouveau in their lives does to them.
Yeah. So the symbolism there for her biting the little thing, whatever that was, the attached appendage, she also introduced the drugs to Beverly. Did. So then there was actually that symbolic carryover, which manifested into an actual rift, I suppose.
Yeah.
Like it actually was a catalyst of sorts. So that's definitely taking the Freudian dream analysis of things and putting it into an actual film picture, which I thought was amazing, by the way. Like the fact that he can actually do that, that's the talent of David Cronenberg. So I have to give props to that.
Oh, yeah. He is borrowing from a flawed philosophy that I do believe he honestly believes in, but I also honestly believe that he makes horror movies first and foremost.
Yeah.
That, just reiterating, everything feels so off in his movies. Things feel alien in his movies, alien yet familiar. And that's because I think that the symbolism he's borrowing from, or, simply just using in his films, the iconography is flawed to begin with, but that iconography is kind of scary. Because Freud was touching on a lot of things that are universal, but drawing some pretty incorrect assertions from them.
You've got a point there with the fact that it's a horror film and it's all off. Because I got that whole off feeling in the very beginning when the credits were rolling through, and you had the anatomy pictures from the Renaissance-inspired sculptures, and then that's all painting the female anatomy right there in the beginning, and the music just doesn't quite match with those anatomy images. So that's a good point.
I think this was a pretty well-made movie. I will always like it, but there is an aspect of nostalgia to me liking it a lot. It was one of the ones I watched when I was getting into this more, I guess, quote-unquote, out-there filmmakers, and Cronenberg's a great gateway to more experimental things. In fact, Cronenberg's just great in his own right, but he's also a wonderful gateway to more daring films.
Yeah. It just didn't quite match that with the themes.
No.
Which is good. That's a good quality for horror.
Mm-hmm. Everything about it was really good. Yeah, man. Any closing thoughts on this one?
I think, I covered it. I don't even think I know.
Yeah, I think we got it. Of course, there's probably a lot of great things. Share your experiences with this film in the comments. Bounce off of our analysis or provide some of your own. This is, I do feel it is one of his more intimate feeling films, because I do think it is a love story, no matter how horrific it is. So I'm sure that a lot of people out there have some pretty intense feelings when thinking about this movie. Share them in the comments if you're willing. I'd definitely love to read them, because that's a cool thing about Freud as well. When you're discussing Freud or analyzing anything Freudian, it ends up psychoanalyzing you, and you end up learning much more about the analyzer than what's being analyzed itself.
Absolutely, yeah.
But that's always interesting to see, and it's always interesting to read. And if nothing else, it's great that Freudian language and symbolism can provide that through art, and that's what Cronenberg does. And any analysis of a Cronenberg film is, in part, an analysis of yourself, because you have to use psychoanalysis to do it. And that's, it's neat. That's a neat trick that Cronenberg does, and he's probably the best at pulling off that trick, that specific one.
Yeah, but take it all with a grain of salt, because we're still doing this through the lens of Freud.
True. Gosh. Hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure to give it a like and share it around. Thanks a lot.